This is Adam Marcus, director of Jason Goes to Hell and Secret Santa, and you are listening to the 80s Slasher Librarian.
Jason X, Chapter 3. Sadly, even without Jason Voorhees, things continued to go downhill for the world. As much of a horror as Jason had been, he had been a localized horror. Whether or not the monster that was Jason Voorhees walked the earth made absolutely no difference when it came to politics, the global deterioration of the ecosystem, or the perennial problems of war, famine, and pestilence. When Dr. Wimmer failed to return to Scranton and all communication with Crystal Lake went unanswered, a military unit was dispatched to investigate. They found the Crystal Lake facility still in lockdown, but were able to access the surveillance records, which told the whole gory tale in full, vivid detail. Since the problem was obviously contained, Central Command instructed the soldiers to leave bad enough alone. There were other more pressing crises to deal with in 2010 AD. Food riots were still going on in the urban areas all over the country despite the declaration of martial law. International relations worsened. Canada closed its borders and tripled the number of armed guards, ordering them to repel all global warming refugees by any means necessary, including the use of deadly force. The equatorial regions in South America, Africa, and Asia roasted, charred, died, and continued to roast unchecked. The dead area spread with terrifying swiftness, affirming the flames that carried it. The oceans died even faster, and poison rained from the sky. By then, the surviving population had managed to transfer itself to orbiting biospheres as the human race prepared to embark on a serious search for a new home planet. 100 years after Rowan LaFontaine had slipped into the dreamless peace of cryogenic stasis, humanity finally made that long-awaited first contact with the race of intelligent extraterrestrials that were capable of interstellar travel. Communication between the two species was difficult. It took many hours to convey a message or to receive one, and the outcome wasn't always entirely successful. But somehow humanity managed to acquire what it called the hyperdrive, in a trade for a pod of dolphins, 2 acres worth of mature cannabis sativa plants, and a dozen human corpses, cryogenically frozen after death. There were 6 male and 6 female corpses, none of them from the Crystal Lake Research Facility. Rowan and Jason Voorhees, long forgotten, remained undiscovered. While the aliens may have been hard to understand, the hyperdrive amazingly was not. The human race simply attached the technology to their biospheres like sophisticated outboard motors, strapped down all the loose breakables, and put the pedal to the metal. Finding a habitable planet wasn't difficult either. Finding one they all agreed would be Earth 2, however, was a different story. Certain of the biospheres didn't want an Earth 2, claiming they had no desire to recreate the mistakes of the past, while others could hardly wait to get started. In the end, some stayed and some moved on to settle elsewhere. Finally, after a prolonged period of breaks in continuity and inconsistent progress, the flow of human history resumed. 3.5 centuries went by. A survey of Earth 1 before, during, and after the 3rd millennium in the Western Hemisphere was, despite its rather uninspired title, the most popular course at New Harvard, the one located in Amherst, NH. Which was the only one of the 6 New Harvard campuses that offered it. NH stood for Northern Hemisphere, of course, but the more tuned-in and alert students knew they could score extra points with Professor Lowe by saying New Hampshire, and demonstrating that they knew the original Amherst had been the name of a town there, as well as in another area called Massachusetts. It was Braithwaite Lowe's contention that he could trace both sides of his family all the way back to the mid-20th century on Earth 1. According to him, most of his forebears had been landowners in the area called New England, not to be confused with Old England, part of an island network located in Earth 1's eastern hemisphere, just south of the Scandinavian leaping tiger. He never bothered to mention that the said forebears had had no connection to the original Harvard, not that anybody ever thought to ask. The cachet of the original Harvard was lost on most. Earth 2 inhabitants, unless they were seriously long-lived or extremely knowledgeable about certain areas of pre-evacuation civilization. The prevac as a whole was, of course, far too enormous a subject for any one person to study. The documentation was so extensive that it was housed on the next world out from Earth 2, where the rigorously indexed archive and its robot custodians took up the entire planet and both its moons. As had always been the case with human beings, interest in other areas and cultures came and went in trends, some lasting longer than others. Academia was not immune. That Professor Lowe's course had not ended up in the academic morgue with a tag on its toe, that said passé, after 3 semesters, was partly a tribute to his political acumen and partly down to good luck with his timing. He had proposed the course while a close friend was in charge of approving changes and additions to the curriculum. The friend happened to owe him a favor in circumstances that all but amounted to blackmail. Lowe was, of course, wise enough to refrain from making even the most veiled allusion to this, but the old friend, who knew exactly what Lowe was doing, approved the entire package, budget and all, with an enthusiasm so intense that he sustained a mild hernia. But even that degree of support alone would not have been enough to save the course from the scrap heap. It was just Professor Lowe's sheer good fortune to have dreamed up a course that suddenly and without warning took off in popularity, to become the kind of runaway hit that confers an ineffable and permanent prestige on everything and everyone associated with it. In the space of an academic year, Braithwaite Lowe went from being a slightly better-than-average lecturer trying to distinguish himself and increase his enrollment numbers to a bona fide celebrity scholar and sought-after expert, with not only his own office, but also his own building and full-time staff of paid employees and student interns, as well as priority status for virtually all requests and requisitions. He also acquired a wealth of new best friends, including some he hadn't actually met, and if he so desired, a different partner in bed every night for the foreseeable future, and, needless to say, tenure. Most people in higher education, especially those at New Harvard, had been sure it wouldn't last, chief among them being Lowe himself. But every semester saw an increase in applications for enrollment from students in a wide variety of disciplines. At the administration's request, Lowe made the requirements for admission tougher, but that didn't seem to discourage most people. If anything, it only made places on the courses even more sought after. Increasing the amount and difficulty of the coursework had the same effect. Lowe decided he would just have to live with being an academic superstar as best he could. There had been other courses that involved off-world field trips, not only to Earth 1, but to other planets as well. And there still were, at New Harvard and elsewhere. But somehow, semester after semester and year after year, more and more students clamored to sign up, to go Lowe, so to speak. If there was anything else at work in Lowe's success other than good luck, it was the fact that the professor had a genuine and quite profound affinity for the subject. This was apparent not just to the lucky students who got in, but to anyone who had the opportunity to observe Lowe at work. The young ex-grunt codenamed Kicker would have verified that, had he been allowed to comment. He had served in the bodyguard detail for Professor Lowe's field trip half a dozen times. He had to admit that the course was worth every bit of its exorbitant price tag, despite the fact that he thought a lot of the stuff that he had the students doing was some pretty silly-ass shit. For example, Lowe always insisted that the class had to dress and act in period as much as possible, which meant the kids would be running around dressed in weird get-ups and saying things like, "Who's your daddy?" or "bling bling," or "get your groove on, dude." Kicker was pretty sure he couldn't have brought himself to do anything like that just to get an A, especially from someone like Lowe. But then, he didn't care much for the guy personally. As Gecko had put it, when they were handing out Swarm, Lowe thought they'd said charm and stood in line twice. Nor was he particularly thrilled at having to babysit a pack of silly, overgrown kids. However, the female students were always a pleasure to look at. Since Professor Smarm had his pick of the students, he picked carefully. The current group included some pretty respectable talent. As always, Kicker made sure he kept his distance. The last thing he wanted was to get cuboed by Lowe. Lowe would not hesitate to do it either. He'd written up guys for conduct unbecoming official duty on more than one occasion, usually because he thought they might be giving him some competition for the ladies' attention, according to the rumor mill. Still, Kicker had been hoping that the tall blonde lab assistant was making the trip down to the surface with the rest of them this time around. She had been on the last 2 field trips as Lowe's paid staff, and although he hadn't much chance to spend a whole lot of time in her company, he could definitely tell she was noticing him the same way he was noticing her. Of course, he wasn't supposed to be fraternizing with anyone on the staff either, but the risk factor was a lot lower with staff, who were considered less vulnerable. If the Sarge caught him sniffing around the blonde lab assistant, the most he might do was rip him a new one. But anyone stupid enough to try putting the moves on a student could end up facing a court-martial, even an ex-grunt with a spotless record. If there were any students worth that kind of shitstorm, Kicker had yet to meet them. Exactly what it meant, then, was that he was willing to risk his life, but not his career, for these nubile hardbodies. This wasn't something he usually bothered to think about. In fact, the only thing he was supposed to be thinking about now was what might be waiting for them at the bottom of the staircase in this subterranean compound he had just broken them into on Lowe's orders. He had given up telling Lowe to stay further back and keep his students with him. Professor Smarm and the kids were right on his heels. Only their air filtration mask kept him from feeling their collective breathing down his fucking neck. Kicker had tried to impress on them that he couldn't protect them too well unless they stayed further behind him, and for their part they would listen, understand, and do whatever the hell they wanted. Even Professor Smarm, who would have known better, but then the man had been on a lot more Earth-1 expeditions than Kicker or even Sergeant Brodsky, and he hadn't come up against anything more threatening than the crap environment and the barely breathable air. For the last couple of centuries, there hadn't been any life on the planet other than a few varieties of bug that survived by eating each other, and contrary to all those corny old movies, Lowe was so fond of showing his students. None of the insects had mutated into 50-foot fire-breathing monsters. The largest ones Kicker had ever seen were about the size of his thumbnail. Not that he had seen many, they seemed to have an aversion to humans. Gecko had suggested it was racial memory, a knowledge of what humans had done to Earth-1 etched into their buggy little cells. Too bad Gecko had stayed on the Grendel instead of coming along, Kicker thought, trying to wave Lowe and his students further back as he crept down the stairs, keeping his weapon up and ready. He could have used her sense of humor as well as her help, but Brodsky had decided one guard was enough. This site was the last stop on the tour before they headed back to Earth-2, and Lowe was only taking 3 students in for a look around. There were, supposedly, the 3 that he considered to be the most intelligent, if the whispers he had overheard were as true as they were envious. Since all the students were supposed to be somewhere on the sunny side of genuine genius, Kicker couldn't see the point of having any further distinctions, unless Lowe wanted to make them even more competitive than they already were. Maybe that was what Professor Smarm got his rocks off on, watching them all jockey for position, or rather one of the ways he got his rocks off. If there was a no fraternization rule for professors at New Harvard, Kicker knew for a fact that Brathwaite Lowe wasn't troubled by it. He reached the bottom of the stairs and held up one hand, signaling the rest of them to stop while he had a look around. Christ, air was not only still circulating down here, but it was also still being processed. Amazing. This was one of those places designed to survive pretty much anything short of the whole planet being vaporized. It had to date back to one of those scary periods, either the Cold War or later on at the turn of the century, when terrorism was on the rise. After half a dozen hours as a glorified babysitter, Kicker had not failed to learn almost as much as the paying customers. There weren't many structures of that type, and Kicker had never expected to see one, except as a holographic reproduction. But here he was, actually standing inside the real thing, breathing air that was centuries old. He heard someone coming down the stairs to join him, and he turned to find KM on his left, looking alert and matter-of-fact as always. Kicker gave her a small nod. If he couldn't have Gecko with him, KM was an acceptable substitute. He had made his doubts about her at first. They all had, especially the Sarge. But she had showed them almost immediately that there was nothing to worry about. Now she stood very still, her head turning slowly as she gave the area a thorough once-over. He had already spotted the big metal door several feet ahead of them, and he was pretty sure KM would suggest they check that out first, but he didn't mind waiting for her to give the okay. Only he was hoping that would be sooner rather than later. All of a sudden, he was starting to feel damn chilly. Abruptly, KM went over to the door and scrubbed at something with one hand. She stepped back, and Kicker saw it with the tiny window. He went over to take a closer look and realized right away that this was where the cold was coming from. Giant freezer on the other side, full of very old groceries? The only thing he could see through the window, besides frost, was the glow from some kind of light source. Guess the refrigerator lights didn't always go out in the old days, he thought, with a chuckle. He turned to KM, intending to ask her something, but she was busy with an array of controls on a panel next to the door. Abruptly, there was a loud hum, followed by the sound of large metal gears put into motion after ages of inactivity, and then a cracking sound like an iceberg breaking. As the cracking grew louder, Kicker felt the floor vibrating under his feet, and he braced himself, thinking it might be an earth tremor or a quake. There was a long, drawn-out metallic groan, and then the door was swinging open. Automatically, Kicker stepped back, raising his weapon, while KM calmly positioned herself in front of him, but well out of his line of fire. "Everyone stay put," Lowe called out from the staircase, somewhat needlessly, considering that none of the students were stupid enough to rush down trying to be first to go through. Kicker figured it was some kind of professor thing. "KM?" Thick fog rolled out of the doorway as the temperature where they were dropped at least another 10 degrees in almost as many seconds. KM stood perfectly still, letting it billow around her, while she took some readings with her equipment. "No viruses, no bacteria, no toxins," she said finally. "It's clean." She looked over her shoulder at Kicker, and then walked through the open doorway. He followed, keeping his weapon raised and hoping his fingers wouldn't be too numb to work properly if he had to use it. But there was nothing in the room except a lot of very old power conduits and equipment, much of which lay scattered and broken on the floor. Clearly, there had been some kind of physical fight in here. Kicker had seen enough brawls to know what the aftermath looked like. Judging from the layers of ice crystals on everything, whatever had gone on here had happened only minutes or possibly even seconds before everything had frozen. Or, he thought uneasily, maybe even during. Either way, there hadn't been any activity in this room since. Everything had remained just as the former occupants, whoever they were, had left it, until KM had unlocked the door and let them in. Good Christ, what a find! The professor was going to wet his pants. Kicker turned to give the all-clear to Lowe and the others, but they were already coming in, loosening their protective outer clothing and removing their goggles and filter masks. "Amazing!" Lowe said, wide-eyed with awe as he looked around. "It's still cold." Kicker barely managed to restrain himself from asking the professor if he was sure about that, as he moved into the best position for observing both the doorway and as much of the room as possible. As tempting as it was to get mouthy with Lowe, he wouldn't be doing himself any favors. Better to tell Brodsky that Professor Smarm was really starting to get on his nerves, so the Sarge could rotate him out of the bodyguard detail and give him a break. Let him stay on the mothership and handle equipment maintenance, which was what the rest of the unit was doing at this very moment. A small figure whose ill-fitting storm coat dragged on the floor pushed past Lowe impatiently. Professor Smarm showed no reaction to this rudeness. He never did. Not with this student, anyway. Janessa something or other. Her parents were famous, mainly for being well-known lineage snobs, but also because there were actually 3 of them rather than the customary 2. Not a ménage à trois, but simply 3 people who had participated in a pioneering experiment to pull genetic material and produce offspring with more than 2 biological immediate parents. Janessa had been one of the first successful births to come out of the project, and she had been riding her celebrity for all it was worth. Kicker couldn't blame her for that, but he didn't much like her either. He found her too stuck on herself and too heartless to refrain from flaunting her various advantages, one of them being Lowe's overly indulgent attitude towards her. She was genuinely bright, and from time to time, Kicker wondered if that was why her fellow students hadn't killed her yet. She ripped off her goggles and shook out her dark hair, looking around and wrinkling her nose with disgust. Since she had been to all the other sides, she had tried to get Lowe to let her sit this one out, back on the Grendel, but for once he wouldn't let her have her way. Consequently, Her Majesty had made sure that Lowe and everyone else understood that she was not amused. Not that it did her any good. Lowe and the other students didn't care, and neither could KM, while Kicker himself was entertained. Her Majesty's bad mood was also lost on the extremely skinny guy who stumbled in behind her. Azrael Ben Ruby was the youngest member of the class, a child prodigy who had recently turned 17. It was an age that he insisted made him too old to be a child anything, in keeping with the spirit of Dr. Lowe's course. The prodigy, formerly known as a child, was a more accurate and therefore more acceptable term. Kicker thought that was a hoot, even before he'd had the reference explained to him. But then he was fond of the kid. All the ex-grunts were, including Brodsky, to the point where Azrael was practically the unit's unofficial mascot. Dallas, in particular, spent a lot of time playing virtual reality games with them down in the area near the cargo hold. Kicker himself had joined them a couple of times to hunt the big dinosaur-style beast Azrael was so fond of designing. Dallas referred to them as disgustosauruses for their tendency to over-salivate. Cenarion came in almost a full 5 seconds after Janessa. He was doing that a lot lately, giving the girl a wide berth. Kicker couldn't really blame him for obvious reasons, but what puzzled him was that the kid didn't seem to even have a mild animal attraction to her at all. The tall, brainy student had not exactly been wild about the girl to begin with. Kicker had picked up on that immediately. Perhaps it was just a simple personality conflict. The kid saw himself as a serious scientist and disapproved of her because she was one of those pretty girls who knew she was hot and was only too happy to work that to her advantage. But Kicker had noticed that over the last week, the kid had gone from just ignoring her to going out of his way to avoid her altogether. Was she really getting on his nerves that much? Or was he just making sure that Lowe knew he didn't have the slightest interest in her? Seeing as how Lowe obviously did, it didn't take a genius to know that crowding Professor Smarm was the best way to fail the course. Either explanation was reasonable, but Kicker couldn't get over the feeling that there was actually some other factor at work, something that had to do with KM, who showed a marked tendency to keep to within 10 feet of Suneron whenever possible. Kicker was almost certain that nothing was going on there, but judging from the body language, Suneron's, of course, but surprisingly KM's as well. It was only a matter of time before something happened. Talk about kinky. It was too kinky even for Lowe, which gave KM the distinction of being the only good-looking female the professor wasn't interested in. Probably saved Suneron a lot of grief. But not from Janessa. What's her name? If Lowe didn't see Suneron as possible competition, Janessa didn't feel the same way about KM. Kicker got the definite impression that she didn't much like the idea of a man being more drawn to someone else than to her, even if she didn't actually want him. That was understandable, Kicker supposed, for a pampered, spoiled brat who was used to taking it for granted that she was the most desirable girl in the room, or on the whole planet. What was really odd, however, was KM's attitude. Occasionally, he caught her looking at Janessa with an expression that, had he seen it on anyone else's face, he would have immediately identified as jealousy. But how KM could have been jealous, well, whatever that was all about, he didn't actually want to know. There was always some kind of weirdness going on where students were involved. In 2 months, the course would be over, and he could just forget about it. Right now, however, things were really starting to get interesting, even more so than usual. Azrael was practically bouncing on tiptoe in front of some kind of storage unit that took up about a third of the room they were in. peering through a heavily frosted porthole-style window. "Look at this! I mean, check it out!" he said, looking around at everyone else, Kicker included. "Awesome! This is the real deal, isn't it?" He turned a goofily hopeful gaze on the professor, who nodded at him with approval. "It certainly is," Lowe told him in a grandly authoritative teacher voice. "Now, someone tell me what you make of that, if anything." He licked his lips, and Kicker realized that the man was actually as excited as the kid, possibly even more. "Well, it's some kind of a big frozen storage container," Azrael said, "right?" Cineron joined him in front of it. "I'd say it's probably a cryostasis unit," he said. "I guess an early port series." He looked around. "KM?" KM consulted her handheld unit. "Z-Port 11. Manufactured around 2010. Precise historic records are inconsistent." No one said anything for a moment. Then Cineron's face broke into a broad smile. "So, is anyone else thinking what I'm thinking?" "Kicker?" Lowe beckoned to him. "Open it up for all of us." Kicker waved them all back as he went over to the unit and took a closer look at the controls on the outside. A cryostasis unit had been his guess as well, except, like everyone else on Earth 2, he had been taught back in primary school that cryostasis technology had not been perfected for regular use until after the people of Earth 1 had actually left the surface of the planet and immigrated to the orbiting habitats. But there was hard evidence to the contrary, right in front of him. This was the find of the century, and he had had the major stroke of luck to be in the party that discovered it. "Oh, man," he thought as he searched for something that looked like a release for the door. What were the odds that babysitting duty would put him smack in the middle of a landmark moment in human history? Damn, this really was something. Did it mean that some people really had stayed behind and tried to survive underground? Or had everybody who had worked on this died before they could go public? Next to the controls on the front of the unit, he found a button about the size of his palm and tried pressing it. Abruptly, there was the sound of old machinery starting up after an extremely long period of inactivity, and then a noise like an airtight seal loosening. Kicker took hold of something that might have been a handle covered in ice, braced his foot against the unit, and pulled. There was a loud whoosh, and he found himself enveloped in a frigid cloud of fog and tiny ice crystals. Should have left his goggles on, he thought as he squeezed his eyes shut and turned his face away, wincing under millions of incredibly sharp pinpricks. Behind him, Janessa, whoever, made a fussy, startled noise. "What the hell is that?" she said. "Humanoid," KM responded, taking a reading on it. "Organic composition unclear." "My God," said Lowe. "He's a monster." Kicker felt the ice crystals on his face turn to mist as he took a step back and wiped the excess moisture from his eyes, so he could get a look at whatever had been locked up in the cryo unit. At first, he thought it was an attack dummy of the kind used in combat training. Had somebody managed to sneak down here ahead of them and plant it as a joke? Gecko and Condor, maybe. It was just the kind of stunt they'd have pulled, but his mind rejected it even as it was occurring to him, leaving aside the fact that attack dummies weren't dolls to be posed with a weapon held in one upraised hand. There was the matter of time. Even if the entire squad, Brodsky included, had been in on it, they could not have set everything up this quickly without leaving some kind of trace. "Who can tell me what he's wearing on his face?" Lowe asked. Janessa pushed in front of Kicker impatiently and looked up at the thing. It was about 2 feet taller than she was. Some kind of 20th century carbon filtration unit," she guessed. Kicker moved back to his original position as Cineron joined her in the open doorway. "It's a hockey mask," he said. "Very good, Cineron." Lowe sounded genuinely impressed. "What's a hockey mask?" Janessa wanted to know. "Facial armor used in sports outlawed in 2024, KM replied promptly, and looked over at Cineron as if hoping for a sign of approval. "And it's absolute museum quality," Lowe said. "Amazing, isn't it? No doubt about it, we are looking at the find of the century." Kicker felt a mild surge of irritation at hearing Lowe say the very thing he had been thinking aloud. Purely by chance, of course, but still. "Azrael, are you paying attention?" Lowe asked suddenly, without taking his eye off the figure in the cryo unit. Yeah, sure," said Azrael from another part of the room. Kicker turned to see him frowning at some frost-covered detritus sitting on top of a large unmarked box or cabinet. One of the items was a coffee mug that looked exactly like the ones in his sister's donut shop. Kicker couldn't help grinning to himself. Proof once again of the long-lasting quality of a good design. He knew that Azrael wouldn't be able to resist picking the thing up. Worse, he saw that the kid had actually taken his gloves off. Before Kicker could warn him, Azrael had the thing in his hand and had already discovered that he couldn't put it down again. "Well, just don't touch anything," Lowe warned him, and it was all Kicker could do to keep from laughing out loud at the alarmed look on Azrael's face. The kid glanced furtively over his shoulder to see if Lowe had noticed that this bit of helpful advice had come 2 seconds too late. Lowe hadn't. All his attention was on the find of the century. Azrael turned to Kicker and gave him a pained look while he tried to shake the mug loose. Chuckling silently, Kicker made a small dismissive gesture to let him know that he wasn't going to rat him out to the professor. That Azrael possessed genius-level intellect, but was definitely not the sharpest knife in the drawer, and he knew it too, which is probably what made the kid so damn likable. Lowe was saying something about getting the figure in the cryo unit back to the ship, when a voice sounding extremely spooked interrupted him. Guys?" Everyone turned to look at Cineron. He was standing over what seemed to be a pile of junk next to the far wall. "There's another body over here." Kicker held his light out at arm's length to the left while bracing his weapon against his right side, ready to fire one-handed if he had to. He jerked his head at the others, trying to order them back, but no one paid any attention, naturally. They were all dull knives in the drawer today. But at least there wasn't any real threat. There was indeed a body on the floor, and it was frozen as solidly as the one in the cryo unit. 2 corpsicles with nothing on them, Kicker thought, as KM knelt down to take another set of readings. "Well, KM, what can you tell us?" Lowe said anxiously. "She's perfectly preserved," KM said after a moment. Kicker felt the small hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "She? Cell crystallization is at 25%. 25%? Lowe's mouth dropped open. "Are you sure?" "Suggest extensive nanotech and phase 1 cell reconstruction," KM went on with what sounded like a casual air. "Chances of resuscitation are 1 in 5. "That's incredible," said Lowe. Whoa now," Janessa said, pushing past the professor to crouch down next to KM. "Are you saying we could bring her back to life?" "Precisely," KM replied. "But she is deteriorating. Opening the door has compromised her hibernation." "Okay, that's it." Lowe grabbed his radio and called the shuttle pilot. "Lou, get ready for dust-off. We have a priority evac." "Copy that," came Lou's happy-go-lucky reply. "En route in 5. "Not 5, Lowe barked at him. "Now." Kicker gave a short, soundless laugh. If Lowe had talked that way to any other pilot, he'd have gotten an earful of abuse in return. And if he'd failed to apologize, he might have found himself stranded and waiting for a charter to come out and pick him up, which he would have had to pay for out of his own pocket, in advance. It was the most expensive cab ride in human history, and usually just the threat of having to take it was enough to teach self-important academics good manners, although there were a few who'd had to learn the hard way. Spaceflight was always a matter of life or death, and if you wanted to survive it, you didn't interfere with the pilots who enforced this rule by making a point of being actively touchy. Except for Lou, who for some reason was easygoing and friendly under most circumstances. Given his good nature, Kicker wasn't sure how Lou had managed to become a pilot at all, much less make a living at it. It really made him wonder what other pilots thought of this anomaly in their ranks. It also made him wonder about Lou himself. If he didn't get mad, then what did he do? One of these days he'd have to get Lou drunk and ask him. He knew from experience that the only way to get a straight answer out of Lou about anything was to get him pissed drunk first. He slung his weapon and went to where Janessa and Cineron were prepping the body they hoped to resuscitate. As Janessa brushed away more of the frost, he saw the woman had sustained a very nasty stab wound in her midsection. Abdominal wounds were always nasty, but whoever had done this had pulled the blade out again immediately, guaranteeing that she would bleed to death, spending every moment until she lost consciousness in pure agony. Except she had been caught in the freezing process before she could die from her injury. Kicker hoped she had gone under quickly. A loud thunk behind him made him jump, and he turned around just in time to see Azrael trying to dislodge the coffee mug still stuck to his hand by hitting it against the open doorway of the cryo unit. It came off on the second try, but unfortunately the kid also managed to dislodge an enormous chunk of ice from the ceiling of the cryo unit. It fell right at his feet and exploded like a fragmentation grenade made of glass, sending razor-edged shards in all directions. They could all thank Christ it had been so cold in there that none of them had taken off their coats. Kicker thought this as he shielded his face. Usually they whined endlessly about how they were roasting to death whenever he insisted they not remove their protective gear. Maybe if he pointed out that anyone without a coat would look like a mortally wounded porcupine right about now, they would stop giving him such a hard time. Azrael backed away as pieces of ice began dropping down from the ceiling, one after another in bulky, irregular chunks. Damn, when the kid had knocked the big one loose, it had literally destabilized the rest of the ice up there. Heads up, Chicken Little. Kicker took a step towards Azrael, who was looking around with guilty trepidation. That was when he noticed that the figure in the doorway had begun teetering back and forth. God damn it, Kicker thought, with the sensation that Gecko so aptly described as a great rush of shit to the heart. The find of the century was about to topple over and smash into a bajillion itty-bitty pieces right before his very eyes, after which Professor Lowe would probably scream like a girl for the next 36 hours. When everybody's ears stopped ringing, Kicker would almost certainly find out this was his fault somehow. Dereliction of duty for letting Azrael wander around freely, something like that, unless he could catch it. But even as he was lunging forward, it was too late. The air was filled with the incredibly loud noise of long frozen ice cracking as the temperature in the room continued to rise. Not enough for the people to notice any difference, but more than enough to produce a substantial change in conditions that had remained constant for over 400 years. This must be what it sounds like when an iceberg calves, Kicker thought, with a feeling of surreality as he watched the figure in the cryo unit swaying backwards and forwards, seemingly in slow motion. Every sway looked like it would be the last, but the figure would inevitably stop and move in the opposite direction. Fall backwards, he commanded the figure silently in the hope that all the ice and frost on the cryo unit floor behind it might help to soften the impact and prevent it from shattering completely. Instead, the thing wavered and swung itself upright for a fraction of a second, before it tilted forward again and then kept on tilting as it went into its inevitable fall at last. That it was going to land directly on Azrael seemed equally inevitable to Kicker for some reason. Maybe it wouldn't shatter after all, although the kid just might. Azrael had covered his head with both arms against the threat of falling ice chunks. He lowered them just in time to see the thing from the cryo unit about to score a direct hit on him. Kicker was hard put to describe exactly what happened next. Either Azrael had been following an impulse to make up for screwing the pooch by trying to catch the thing before it hit the floor, thus saving the day as well as his grade, or he had simply been raising his arms again in sheer reflex and just not moved quickly enough. Whichever it had been, Kicker was sure that didn't account for the sudden change in the trajectory of the thing's fall. It should have fallen right into the kid's open arms, but at the very last moment it swung several inches to Azrael's right and sideswiped him. Or so Kicker first thought. Then he saw what looked like an enormous liquid red flower blossom where Azrael's right arm had been, and realized. Kicker felt his stomach lurch as the kid screamed. Instantly, KM was at his side, a syringe in one hand and a patch in the other, before Kicker could even reach for his own emergency medkit. No competing with those reflexes, he thought. trying not to feel so relieved about it. Although there was nothing wrong with that, of course, since KM was also better at treating serious injuries in the field. Nothing to do with being squeamish about severed limbs. Even as all this passed through his mind, however, his training was already kicking in, and he went over to examine the figure on the floor. What the hell could have taken the poor kid's arm off? 50 cc's of etheren, KM was saying as the kid screamed again, more in shock than in pain. You'll be fine. What do you mean, I'll be fine? Azrael wailed, clearly outraged by her matter-of-factness. I'm missing my The rest of the sentence was replaced by a long sigh of euphoria. Oh, wow. You're pretty. Kicker glanced up to see the kid looking worshipfully at KM, unaware of anything else including the med-seal she was applying to the 3-inch stump where his arm had been. Nothing was going to bother Azrael for the next 4 or 5 hours. Kicker wished he could have said the same. Slowly he stood up, holding the long blade he had found on the floor, not far from the figure's hands. It was a genuine old-fashioned machete, the real deal. He could see a little of Azrael's blood and tissue starting to freeze on the cutting edge. The old machetes had been some pretty formidable weapons, but Christ, what kind of metal was this? 4.5 centuries in a deep freeze, and 2 minutes after it came out, it could slice through an environmental protective suit and take a man's arm clean off, instead of shattering like crystal? And while he was asking questions, what was all the rest of that stuff staining the blade? The hairs on the back of his neck stood up again, this time sending chills all the way down his spine in a series of waves. Abruptly, Lowe plucked the thing out of his hands with the fussy, possessive air of a man who felt a sudden need to remind everyone that he was in charge. All right, everybody, let's get a move on here. I don't want anybody else getting hurt, he said. He turned to Azrael, who sagged ecstatically against KM, and added, In the future, try not to destroy the 400-year-old artifacts. Can you try that for me, please? Azrael raised his remaining hand and wiggled the fingers, clumsily, without taking his adoring gaze from KM's face. Lowe made an annoyed face and motioned at the kid's arm, still lying on the floor. Kicker picked it up and handed it to Janessa, not only because she was closest to him, but also just to see her reaction. She shoved it back at him with the revolted noise and went back to helping Soneron with the other body. Resigned, Kicker tucked the kid's arm into his belt, noticing Lowe had done the same thing with the machete. He didn't much like the idea of Lowe carrying that thing around, and he knew the professor wasn't about to let him carry it for him, no matter how dangerous it was. Not that he wanted to carry it at all. Nor did he want anyone else to carry it either, he realized. Not even KM. Suddenly he found himself wishing more than anything that he had never picked the thing up at all. That instead he had kicked it away to some far corner where it would have lain undiscovered till the sun went nova, or the heat death of the universe, whichever came first. A blade like that was too dangerous even just lying on a shelf. Nobody needed a weapon like that, least of all a college professor like Lowe, who was now standing in the middle of the room, with a grin even bigger than Azrael's on his face. We're going to make history here, people. I just know it, he announced. True enough, Kicker thought, seeing as how the figure on the floor hadn't shattered after all. Maybe slicing through Azrael's arm had slowed its fall just enough to prevent any serious damage. Or maybe it was down to nothing more than dumb luck. Either way, it was in one piece, which was more than they could say for Azrael. Okay, this has been Chapter 3 of Jason X, the novelization of the motion picture. This was a little bonus upload, guys. I know I said I'd be doing 4 uploads a week guaranteed, but I thought I'd throw y'all an extra chapter just for some fun. I'll still be dropping 4 more uploads as the week goes on. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to seeing how the novel plays out. I know what happens in the movie, but I really do love the fact that the novel is fleshing out the story so much more. Because I really did enjoy this movie, and I can't wait to see what new stuff and everything the novel brings to the story from the movie. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section, and I'll be back tomorrow with some more of Jason X, the novelization of the movie. Till then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and return your books on time, because the late fees are killer.